I'm cold. Please let me inside. I will give you something good. Words from a poor Apache woman. The sky over the tall hills of northern Arizona was gray like old metal, hanging low and heavy without moving. Snow had been falling since morning, not the light kind that stops quickly, but steady snow that made everything quiet and covered the trees so you couldn't see far. The wind wasn't howling, it was worse than that. It was quiet and sharp, cutting through the pine trees and down into the lonely valley where the ground was flat enough for someone to live. John Merritt had been chopping wood since noon, his gloves stiff, shoulders tight from the cold that crept through even his thick coat. He was 35 years old, with a broad chest, worn down from the war and a life he didn't talk about. John lived here because it was far from other people. That was the point. The cabin was his and no one else's, an old building with warped shutters and snow piled thick against its walls. A year ago, he'd covered the second window after it broke in a storm. 2 years before that, he'd buried his last dog under the big tree near the barn. No one visited. There were no neighbors, just trees, ice, and his quiet daily tasks. He'd lived here since his wife died, that was almost 8 years back. Their boy hadn't lived to see his second winter. After that, John stopped going to town more than once each season. No one came out this far unless they were lost, desperate, or planning something bad. So when he heard the sound, that soft, uneven crunch in the snow, faint but real, his first thought was to be careful. He stood up straight, axe still in his hand, eyes looking hard at the woods beyond the fence. At first he thought it was an elk. Then he thought it might be a thief, or worse, someone from Holbrook riding up the trail. He didn't move, just listened, back stiff, boots half buried in snow. Then he saw her. A woman, thin, with no shoes, wearing a torn buckskin dress that flapped at the bottom. Her legs sank through the snow as she stumbled toward the porch. One step, then another, arms held tight to her chest. Her hair was long and black, braided in one thick rope down her back. Her skin was dark brown, face red from wind and tight with cold. Not a settler, Apache. John's stomach tightened right away. Not from hate, he wasn't that kind of man, but from what he knew, what he'd seen. Apache women didn't walk alone in white territory in the middle of winter, with no shoes and nearly collapsing, unless something had gone very wrong. He stepped toward her slowly, his mind already thinking of possibilities. She could be bait. There could be others in the woods waiting. But as she came closer, stumbling now, legs barely lifting through the snow, that thought started to fade. Her face was wrong for a trap. It was raw, tired, scared. She dropped to her knees in the snow, not 10 yards from his steps, her hands falling into the drift, her body swaying like she'd pass out right there. He watched for another second, every instinct in him yelling to stay away, warning him not to get involved. He didn't know her, didn't owe her anything. He lived quiet, and that quiet kept him alive. Then she looked up. "Please," she said. Her voice was dry and tight, barely heard, her lips cracked. "Let me in." John's jaw tightened. He didn't move. "I can give you something good," she added, quieter this time, teeth chattering. "Please." She had nothing. No pack, no boots, no weapon he could see. No frostbite yet, but it was coming. Her fingers were stiff and red. Her toes, sunk deep in snow that must have burned like fire by now. John thought about walking back inside and locking the door. He thought about staying quiet and letting nature do what it was already doing. Let the storm finish her. She'd be gone by morning and no one would know. No risk, no trouble, just the same quiet he always kept. But he didn't move away. Instead, he stepped forward. He crouched beside her, slowly, watching her reactions. She didn't jump back. She was past fear. Her face twisted slightly, not in panic, but in shame. She wasn't begging now. She looked like she was waiting for judgment. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice steady but low. She didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered closed for a second. Then she shook her head, barely. John looked around once, into the trees, into the ridge, into the empty cold white wilderness, and decided. He hooked one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been. Her body tensed against his chest, but she didn't fight him. She didn't speak again. He carried her to the porch, kicked the door open with his boot, and stepped inside. Inside the warmth. The warmth hit them right away. Inside, the fire was steady, built strong before noon. A pot of beans cooked on the stove. The room was simple, just shelves, a bed, a table, and the fire. It smelled like smoke and dust and pine. He set her down gently on the wool rug beside the fireplace and went to grab the thickest blanket from his bed. She leaned against the stone of the fireplace, head tilted back, breathing shallow. Her eyes blinked open, trying to take in the room. She looked at the table, at the rifle on the wall, then at him again. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, but it was weak, dulled by tiredness. John knelt beside her and began wrapping the blanket around her legs. "Keep your feet off the floor," he said. "You'll lose them if they stay that cold." Still nothing. He checked her hands. Her fingertips were rough, the skin tight and red, but not black. "Not yet." He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup, added a pinch of salt and a bit of the honey he'd saved from last spring, and handed it to her. "Drink it slow. If you throw it up, I'm not cleaning it." She took the cup with both hands. They shook as she tried to lift it, but she managed. John sat back on his heels and watched her drink. Her throat moved with each swallow, slow and careful. Her eyes stayed on him, watching, waiting, but she didn't speak again. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer his. It was enough that she was here, that he hadn't left her out there to freeze. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know who she was or what she wanted. But he did know this. No one deserved to die like that, alone in the snow. He'd seen enough of that during the war. Too many. He didn't want company. Didn't want conversation. But he also didn't walk away from people who couldn't stand on their own. Not anymore. The first night. The snow kept falling through the night. It covered the shutters in silence and buried the fences until only the tops of the posts showed through the drifts. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, trying to get in, but the logs held firm. Inside, the fire stayed lit, fed steadily by John's hand every hour. Tala hadn't said another word since she'd been brought in. She hadn't cried either. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything, didn't even flinch when he unwrapped her legs and rubbed warmth back into her feet with cloth and water. She sat there, silent, leaning against the fireplace, her eyes dull but watchful. At some point, she fell asleep with her knees tucked up and the wool blanket wrapped around her body. John hadn't moved her. He just laid another folded quilt beside her in case she woke cold. He watched her for a moment before sitting at the table with a plate of beans and bread. He ate without hurry, listening to the wood crackle and pop, watching the snow drift sideways across the window. His mind kept circling back to her. What tribe was she from? Why was she alone? How far had she walked with no shoes through that snow? The cold could kill fast out here. He knew that better than most. A man couldn't last more than an hour with no shoes in weather like this. And yet she had made it to his door, barely, but still breathing. Around midnight, she stirred. John glanced over. Her eyes were open, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the fire, then at her feet, which were bandaged and resting above a basin of warm water. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket a little tighter. "You're lucky they're still pink," John said, not unkindly. Another hour and they'd have been gone. Her eyes shifted to him slowly. This time she spoke, low and raspy. "I walked 2 days." John frowned. "No boots?" She shook her head. "Taken. When they cast me out." He didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't want to press. But he needed to understand. "Who cast you out?" "My people." That hung in the room for a long time. He could have asked why, but the way she said it, the weight of it, made it clear. She wasn't speaking for sympathy, just the truth. John nodded once. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. He stood, ladled some beans into a bowl, tore off a thick chunk of bread, and set it in front of her with a spoon. She took the bowl slowly, her hands still shaking. She didn't rush the food, just ate steady, every motion careful, like she'd been taught not to waste a single bite. She finished half the bowl before setting it aside and pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What's your name?" he asked. "Tala." He let that sit a moment. "I'm John." She gave a small nod, then turned her face slightly back to the fire. He watched her for a while, waiting to see if she'd speak more. She didn't. He noticed then what he hadn't fully caught before. Her clothes, what was left of them, were for ceremony. Apache-style dress, but the beading, the stitching, even the cut was formal. It wasn't travel wear. It wasn't hunting wear. It was something worn at gatherings, rituals, or important events. It was torn, marked with pine sap, and thin enough to let heat out of her within minutes. "You were important," he said quietly. Tala's jaw tightened. Her gaze stayed on the fire. "I was his wife." "Whose?" "The chief." John leaned back slightly. That explained the ceremonial cloth. The bone necklace. The sharpness in her posture even now. But it didn't explain why a chief's wife had been left to die in the woods. "No children?" he asked, already guessing the answer. She looked at him then, sharp, defensive. "No. Not with him." He didn't press. He just nodded once and leaned back in his chair. She took another small bite of bread, chewing slowly, not looking at him again. "You can stay here," he said, "until the weather breaks." She didn't thank him, just nodded once, quiet. He didn't expect gratitude. What mattered was survival, and she looked like she understood that too. Later that night, John unrolled a spare bed and set it up across the room near the stove. He placed a second blanket on top and gestured toward it. She moved slowly, every muscle tight with cold and caution, but she stood on her own. He watched her test her weight on her feet, wincing, biting back pain, but standing. That surprised him. Most people would be in tears. He turned away to give her privacy as she lay down. Then, for the first time since she'd come in, she spoke again. "You're alone too." He looked back toward her. She wasn't asking, just observing. He nodded. 8 years. She didn't ask what happened. He didn't tell her. They said nothing more. Outside, the wind picked up again. The world turned white beneath the moonlight. Inside, John fed the fire one more log and settled into his own bed. The quiet stretched out. It wasn't warm yet, not between them, not completely. But it wasn't cold anymore either. She was there, alive, breathing. That was enough for now. Days of recovery. By morning, the storm had buried the entire yard under another foot of snow. The fence line disappeared. Even the chicken coop was nearly sealed shut by a wind-carved drift. The sky stayed low and pale, heavy with more of the same. Cold like this didn't let up easily. Not up here. It pressed in day after day until the logs cracked in the walls and the water buckets froze solid if left unattended. John was already outside by dawn, clearing the path to the barn with a shovel. His breath came out in thick clouds, and his fingers, even gloved, stung as he worked. He checked on the cows, 2 of them, and shoveled fresh straw in their stalls. He didn't rush. That was part of staying alive out here. You did the work steady, no matter how bad the wind bit. If he left it, the roof could collapse. If he waited too long, the livestock would suffer. And he wasn't about to let that happen. He hadn't fought through 2 winters up here just to lose it all to sleet. Inside, Tala woke to the smell of ash and beans warming on the stove. Her legs still burned. Her toes, though painful, had some feeling again. She wiggled them beneath the blanket, her brow furrowed from both discomfort and the effort of checking for damage. Her hands were less raw now, but her mind wasn't any quieter. She looked around the cabin again, slower this time, the rifle on the wall, the way everything was positioned. No wasted space, nothing decorative. A man's place, a man who didn't expect guests. She sat up, wrapped the blanket around her, and slowly tested her feet on the ground. Pain shot up her calves, but she could bear it. She limped to the stove, holding onto the table for balance. That's where John found her when he stepped back in, her back to him, one hand braced on the edge of the stove as she tried to ladle food from the pot. "You should have waited," he said flatly, stepping inside and kicking the door closed behind him. She didn't turn. "I'm not helpless." He didn't argue with that. He took off his gloves, unwrapped his scarf, and moved toward the basin to wash up. That doesn't mean you're not injured. She finally looked over her shoulder, her face guarded but calm. I can do small things. John gave a brief nod. All right. Just don't fall over. He dried his hands and came over to adjust the flame. She moved aside, allowing him to finish ladling 2 bowls. He handed her one without ceremony. They ate at the table again, this time together, still quiet, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't tight with uncertainty. It was practical. Midway through the meal, John asked what had been on his mind all morning. Where were you trying to go? Tala chewed slowly before answering. I wasn't. He frowned slightly. So what then? I just walked. He didn't understand. Into the snow with no food or boots. She looked at him steadily. I wasn't supposed to live. The room went still. John's hand tightened around the tin cup. He didn't ask the next question. He didn't need to. She'd answered enough. You were cast out to die. Tala nodded. It's what's done. He stared at the table. That kind of thinking didn't sit right with him. He'd seen war. He'd seen cruelty. But this, turning your back on someone because they couldn't have children, leaving them in winter to starve, it worked against everything he believed living should be about. You don't strike me as someone who gives up, he said finally. Tala's face twitched barely, but her voice stayed even. I didn't want to die, but I accepted it. John didn't know what to say to that. There wasn't a right answer. He stood up, cleared the bowls, and set them in the wash basin. You can stay here, he said again. Firmer this time. Long as you need. I got room. Tala looked at him. Really looked. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer her anything he couldn't keep. That afternoon, she asked for a knife. John hesitated. What for? My hair, she said, pointing to the frayed ends of her braid. It's tangled and dirty. I don't want to carry the past on my back. He nodded once and handed her his small utility blade. She took it without ceremony and went to sit by the fire. He didn't watch her do it, but later he saw the black braid laid out on the floor beside the coals. She had trimmed it short, clean, and even, just below the shoulders. Her eyes were calmer afterward. # building trust. That evening, she helped peel potatoes while he salted meat. She moved slowly but didn't complain. She never asked questions about his past, about the woman whose photograph sat face down on the shelf, or about the years he'd spent alone in this place. And he didn't ask her about the chief, or how long she'd been his wife, or how many times she'd tried to give him a child. But he noticed something else. Her hands weren't clumsy. They moved with skill, practiced from years of work. This wasn't someone who'd lived soft. She'd skinned animals, built fires, cleaned hides. She'd known labor. That night, after the fire burned low, she asked quietly, "Did your wife die here?" John sat in the chair by the fire, arms crossed, his jaw tightened, but he answered, "No. Fever, down in Holbrook. My boy caught it too." Tala nodded slowly. "You stayed here after?" He met her eyes. There wasn't anything left down there worth staying for. The silence stretched again, but this one wasn't awkward. It felt understood. "You're not like most white men," she said finally. John didn't respond. He didn't take it as praise. Just a fact. "You're not like most Apache women," he said back. He got up, stirred the fire back to life, and went to check the shutters. Behind him, Tala watched, not in fear, not in suspicion. For the first time, she wasn't waiting to be sent away. And for the first time, John didn't feel like she was temporary. # growing closer. The snow had started to settle into hard crusts by the 4th morning. Temperatures had stayed low enough that nothing melted, but the blizzard winds had eased. Still no clear skies, but there was less urgency in the cold. John noticed it first when his axe didn't stick with every swing, when the barn door didn't freeze shut by mid-morning, and when the cows were moving easier, breathing clouds but not huddling close to the walls anymore. Inside, things had shifted too. Slowly, subtly. Tala no longer needed help to stand. She still limped, but she moved around the cabin on her own, fetching kindling, helping peel vegetables, straightening the bedding without being asked. She didn't speak much, but John had stopped waiting for her to. When she did speak, her voice was calmer. Grounded. John had added another log to the fire when he heard it, an awkward scraping of metal and a muttered breath. He turned and saw her struggling to carry the water bucket from the stove to the wash basin. It was too heavy and her grip weak from cold-damaged fingers. "You don't have to do that," he said, crossing the room. "I want to," she replied, keeping her eyes on the bucket as it tipped slightly. "Let me do something." He took it from her anyway, not as dismissal, but with steady hands, pouring it without spilling. She didn't fight him, just took a step back and stood quietly until it was done. Then she said it, out of nowhere, voice low but firm. "It wasn't me." John turned toward her, confused. "I wasn't the one who couldn't give him children," she clarified. He didn't interrupt. John didn't judge her. He'd seen worse done by better men. Tala looked down at her hands. "When the bleeding returned 2 moons ago, I knew I was still able. But it didn't matter anymore. I'd already been cast out." John nodded slowly. That explained the timing. Why she looked barely alive when she arrived. She'd been left with no time to prepare, just turned out of the body with no purpose in their eyes. No one checking if she had food or boots.